Hi, I hope lunch was all right. Thanks. Okay, that'll work. Okay. So I'd just like to thank everybody for coming and thank Anna for the invitation. We love DogRisk, and I hope everybody else does as well, and we'll donate as much as you can because it's great work. I developed this talk actually for veterinarians, and it's because I'm told that they're confused. What that means is that they are actually seeing diets beyond the big threes, kibbles, and canned foods. That's great news, right? Really good news. Is it not going to work?
Nope.
Nope, not going to work. Okay.
Wait, I'll fix that.
Okay.
It's the only thing I can fix here. Let's see. Whoops. No. Green.
Oh, that's lovely. Thank you. Okay. So, what veterinarians have been taught as far as evaluating diets, you need to feel safe when you recommend diets to the pet owners that come to see you. You are in some ways responsible if you recommend a poor diet, an unsafe diet. And so the criteria for most veterinarians are, number one, is it complete and balanced, which theoretically you should be able to read on the label. In reality, it doesn't actually mean that much. But number two, is it safe? Is it free from toxins and pathogenic bacteria and that sort of thing? So those are really the only criteria. And beyond that, what we're taught is that we should also be able to trust the company. It should be a company that is big and has been on the market for years and has a great track record. So as you know, the big three make kibble and canned foods, and that's what we have essentially been taught to trust. But now that there are these other pet food formats, I would propose that we do need a different way to classify foods. And if we classify them by processing, I think it makes sense to arrange them in a spectrum from most processed to least processed, or vice versa. And if you do that, I think you can argue that at the top of the list for most processed foods are kibble and wet foods, which is canned or Tetra Pak. Kibble is also called extruded food, if you didn't know. After that comes semi-moist, which is not very prevalent right now in the market, but I think it's coming more and more. And then there are the fresh foods. Now, they can start out with cooked ingredients, and then they are subjected to another processing step, air dehydration or freeze drying, and I'm calling those processed, even perhaps not ultra processed, but greatly processed. And then there are those that start out raw and they're submitted to one processing step, either dehydration or freeze drying. And then you have the lightly cooked and frozen, no processing steps other than cooking, so that's one processing step, and the commercial raw frozen. Of course, homemade is freshest as all if you take it off the oven or out of the freezer and give it to the dog or cat. So that's one way of looking at this. Processing, I don't want you to leave this talk thinking that processing is a bad thing. It has its benefits, lots of them. And by the way, the U.S. Department of Agriculture defines processing in a way that is kind of unfamiliar to us when we talk about pet food. It includes things like washing and chopping. If you look at the AFCO definition of natural, it basically says that a kibble can be natural, which is, once you get started thinking about raw and minimally processed food, it's kind of astonishing. At any rate, the benefits of processing include risk reduction. In fact, that's a primary benefit. So it can accomplish pathogen mitigation as well as retard spoilage. Also, a big plus for most pet owners is convenience. As the owner of a 75-pound German Shepherd, I'm very tempted by convenience. So it increases shelf life, makes it easier to handle if you have to take it to events like dog shows and things like that. It also allows pet food companies to upcycle byproducts, which of course they've been doing for decades and decades now. And that's a benefit when you think about using those products and what would happen to those products if they went into landfills. You can also add nutritional components during processing to make foods more nutritious. But processing can add harmful compounds, which we're going to talk about a little bit. I want to just start with this. When we talk about the different pet food formats, I see this claim all over the place. And if you look on the right, that's a kind of a long quote that you'll find all over Facebook that basically starts out with, "Don't let anyone convince you that dry kibble is safer to feed your pet over minimally processed pet food." We're going to get to that's maybe partially true, but I want to just kind of show you the numbers and how they got there. So these are some very nice numbers. The Truth About Pet Food website is very good about collecting numbers from regulatory bodies. And if you look over to the left, she's actually determined all of the recalls for each type of food, dry, canned, cooked, or raw, from 2020 to 2023. But then over to the right, what she did was compare, this is some really weird math. She compared the percentage of pounds recalled to the percentage of sales and left it at that. And that does not give you any approximation of your actual risk of exposure to a problem. You have to divide the pounds recalled by the pounds either sold or produced or something along those lines. And when you do that, you get different numbers. And in fact, when I did that for 21 and 22, the recall rate for raw was over 10 times that of the recall rate for kibble. That's specifically for food pathogens, and that's the trick here, is that you have to look specifically at the type of recall. And so this comes from a different website. This is a veterinary technician who's board certified as a specialist in nutrition. And what she did was divide up the recalls by type. So bacterial on the left, and if you go to the from left to right, it's foreign object, FO, vitamin D, aflatoxin, and then labeling problems. And, if you look at kibble, which is the dark brown bars, by far it leads the other formats as far as foreign objects, aflatoxin, labeling. Vitamin D has been the most problem in canned foods, but raw foods are a much, much bigger risk for exposure to a pathogen. And I need to stop here and talk about how I think the pathogen risk could be different in different countries, right? So a lot of these come from Western Europe, Western. These reports are coming from the UK. I've seen them from Italy and Spain, but most of them from the US. And we have CAFOs. We have intensive production systems for cattle that ensure that these pathogens are going to develop more reliably. So with that said, the recalls, and this is in the US, for pathogens, much higher for raw than for any other pet food format. So you just have to be specific about the type of risk you're talking about. So if we, I talked about one or more processing steps, and that comes from an article that was written by Donna Radatic, and she proposed dividing foods up this way. So any food that is submitted to two or more processing steps would be called ultra-processed, right? So 2 or more. If it has been submitted to just 1 or less processing step, we call that minimally processed. And the processing that she's talking about is either thermal or heat, so extrusion, cooking by retort, which is canned food, that sort of thing. Or pressure, high pressure pasteurization is used a lot in the US. So that's how I'm going to classify them. And when I teach veterinarians, I like to have them think in terms of a spectrum. And so if you look to your right, that is the most processed. Again, you could probably flip kibble and canned foods depending on how they're produced, but those are the most processed. And then you go down your spectrum from semi-moist. I added one here, which is kibble plus raw pieces, and that matters for something I'm going to show you later regarding oxidative status of foods. And then air dehydrated, because that involves heat. And then cooked and frozen, and then raw in either freeze-dried or frozen form. So let's first talk about ultra-processed foods, and I want to point out that there's a lot of words on these slides, and I actually wouldn't have time to get into the weeds with you on these. So obviously you'll have access to the presentation after this meeting. I'm just going to hit the high points. So I want to start with canned foods, and canned foods are very old. They've been around for a while. In general, they take the raw ingredients and either turn them into a slurry or chop them into chunks, or more often use something like soy to prepare chunks, to make chunks that look like meat. And then this is where we get into the problem that they are cooked for, it can be an hour. Not all of them are cooked for an hour, but that's pretty standard at 120 degrees centigrade. So that's a long cooking process. They also last a long time on the fridge, on the shelf, and they're convenient. The disadvantages are what we're here to talk about, though, in comparison. And in that case, if you look at the studies, canned foods contain the highest concentrations of AGEs of any pet food format. People who deal with them also talk about them being smelly and messy. From the nutritional point of view, they may or may not be complete and balanced. And in the last decade, you've seen more and more of these produced as toppers or complementary foods, as they've been called here this weekend. So you have to look at the label really carefully because they may look like they're intended to be given as 100% of the diet, and they can be dangerous that way. One big advantage is that they're full of water. They're 70 to 85% generally water, but as I mentioned, they have the highest AGE content, and if they're cooked for longer and at higher temperatures, they're going to have higher nutrient losses. And I want to say something here about these losses. If it is an essential nutrient, something that is among the 40-odd nutrients that are regulated by FEDIAF and AFCO. What happens is scientists, pet food nutritionists know which ones are sensitive to heat, and they're going to do studies that tell them exactly how much they have to add pre-cooking so that the end product has enough of it. Theoretically speaking, it depends on the company, how good they are, but that's what's supposed to happen. But there are thousands, probably tens of thousands of compounds in a single food ingredient, not just 40. And so when you think about how many of those might be heat sensitive, there could be thousands lost. And so it's a very different nutritional sort of scene in a cooked versus a raw ingredient. And the longer you cook and at the higher temperatures, the more is lost. So the next that we'll talk about briefly is kibble, or extruded pet food. And if you're not familiar with the process, you can start over on the left. What happens is everything is mixed together. It is fed into a hopper that goes to the extruder. You can see where it's getting to be red there. That's where the heat happens, in the extruder. And for many kibbles, that's only a minute or two, maybe up to 3 minutes. So it's not exposed to the heat that's that high for very long. Where it's exposed for longer period is in the dryer. That can be up to 20 minutes. So it's exposed to heat a couple of times during this sort of whole process of manufacturing the kibble. But there's a caveat to that. If you look over to your right, this is kind of a schematic of the extruder. And so you can see the arrow shows you where the raw materials are going in to the feeding screw, which pushes food into the mixer. And so the mixer is there, and the mixer makes sure everything is, theoretically speaking, very thoroughly mixed. And then from there it goes into the extruder. Now, extrusion is how pasta is formed, some kinds of cereals. So you've eaten food that's extruded. And what happens is that this tube, the food becomes pressurized in there, and that pressure is what makes the heat develop. And then at the end of the tube is the die, and that's where the die actually has the shapes in it, and that's where the little pieces are cut. look up at the top right, and you can see that ingredient, and it looks like nice frozen meat, and you'd like to think that that's what goes into the extruder since the ingredients are going to be heated twice, but in fact, it's more often something like that, meat in that form. And that means that ingredients in a kibble could be cooked 3 times or more. So, kibble can be considered highly processed under the best of circumstances. So, we've talked about the heat, and the disadvantages are, again, AGE formation because of the heat. AGEs are formed as a product of time and temperature. So it's the combination of time and temperature in addition to the ingredients in the food. So formation is kind of complex. Another disadvantage to kibble, though, in my opinion, is that it's really energy dense. If you think about most real foods, they're 70%, 75% water. Human and animal tissues are 70, 75% water. Kibble is 10% water. So any animal that can develop a normal thirst reflex, experience thirst and respond to it by drinking water, probably okay, even if they eat this, every day for their lives. But cats are not in that category. So this is why you hear more and more people talk about not feeding kibble to cats, because they don't rehydrate themselves very well. And the other problem, I started saying energy dense. Energy dense means that, for instance, a wet food or any tissue might have 1 to 1.5 kilocalories per gram of food, but a dry food can have 3 to 4. I've seen some that are up to 6 kcals per gram. So if you put look at that on the right, if you put, unlimited kibble in front of your cat, a large proportion of those cats or dogs are not going to stop eating when they should. And that's a problem with an energy-dense food. So nutritional characteristics, by and large, these are claimed to be complete and balanced. And the thing about dry foods now, they used to be, all of them were quite high in starch, up to 60%, anywhere from 40 to 60% was pretty common. But, in this new day, when we talk about Paleolithic diets, we have some now that are quite low in starch. And on a dry matter basis, some are like 10 to 12%. That's very, very low. But the thing about dry food is you really can't make it without some starch. So there will always be some starch in kibble, at least to this date that I know of. Like canned foods, the essentials are lost, but they're replaced. It's the extra nutritionals, as we call them, those other thousands of compounds that can be lost, and we don't know about those. We don't know to what extent and which ones. We can guess, but we don't know. They do contain AGEs, and as I mentioned, they're energy dense, which is a problem. I don't have to go through AGEs in detail, but just remember that they are a product of the Maillard reaction. There are a lot of different ways to pronounce it. I pronounce it the French way because I think he was a French guy. Again, it is formed from specific amino acids in your protein molecules combining with a reducing sugar. Glucose is one of them, and when you heat it, you get these Maillard reaction products, and it is, again, a matter of the ingredients. Do they have starch? Do they have proteins? How much and what proportion? And then how long you cook it and at what temperature. And I just wanted to point out that one of the very first guys to talk about this as a health problem, Jamie Ubari, who is an MD in New York City, he came up with this comparison. So if you look at the tomato in the upper right, I don't know what their units are. There's some kind of weird activity unit, but in a tomato there are 23 of these AGE units. In French fries, 1,500. In a big burger, 7,800. And for context, they recommend that you don't get over 3,000 of these activity units a day. So a burger has ruined your week, AGEs are responsible for health problems related to diabetes, renal disease, pulmonary disease, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, cancer, aging, osteoarthritis, cardiovascular disease, atherosclerosis, many things that you can think of. And we do have preliminary data showing they're a problem in dogs. So there are plenty of studies showing that they're contained in foods that have been heated. Notice I didn't say kibble and canned foods. I said foods that have been heated. and that if you feed them to dogs and cats, they show up in the plasma, or at least in dogs they show up in the plasma, and in dogs and cats they show up in the urine. And we do have these preliminary studies saying that AGEs accumulate in the tissues of dogs with these conditions: diabetes, cataracts, osteoarthritis, cognitive dysfunction, and then vascular diseases. So they're probably a problem. We just don't have proof yet. I want to show you, if you were here a couple of years ago, you've probably seen this, but I wanted to show you this internal study that we did. HMF, hydroxymethylfurfural, is one of these AGEs, and just pay attention to the means in that yellow bar. If you look at raw food, none. We didn't detect any HMF. But if you look at canned foods, we've got ours on the left, and we've got a competitor on the right, 9 versus 91. I think this is because the competitor has a higher carbohydrate content, higher starch content. Now, if you look at a couple of kibbles, ours is at 117, theirs is at 199, 100 to 200. Probably most kibbles are going to fall in there. But look at this thing from another competitor, and it is a baked kibble. Don't let anybody tell you that baking is more gentle than extrusion. It's not, depending on how long you cook and at what temperature and what's in the food. This food clearly has some quality control problems. So, and this is something that you don't find on the label, right? You're never going to know that this happens. How do you trust a food? That's a whole nother lecture. So semi-moist foods, I'm beginning to see these make a comeback. I grew up in the 60s, and that thing on the left, Gainsburger, was always fed our dogs. They thought they were fantastic. They tasted good. I think now it's because they may be pretty high, they may be pretty sweet. They are cooked, and they contain these humectants that keep them moist, and these humectants often are a type of sugar. So I think the sugar content, I don't know because I'm not going to taste this stuff, but I think the sugar content is enough that probably they taste sweet, and so there are some dogs that are not going to be able to resist them. At this point, we don't know if many or if all of them are complete and balanced or not. They've got a pretty high moisture content, and if you'll just look at the sort of the mass market, the ingredients of the mass market one on the top, you see 2 forms of syrup, right? 2 forms of corn syrup. But if you look at the one on the bottom, and this one is marketed as natural, and it's got a much more attractive sugar in there. It's actually a sugar alcohol, coconut glycerin. So it may be natural and marketed as natural. I don't think coconut glycerin is really a natural product, but they have to have some kind of sugar to make it a semi-moist. So just be aware of that. And then dehydrated foods. So dehydrated foods are commonly marketed as much more gently cooked. And in general, these are done on trays like this. You can start with dried products, but probably more often they actually mix all of the ingredients together with whatever mincing or chopping they do for that particular product, and then dry the whole thing as one. And you can see that the heat is indeed lower, but it's usually a much longer cooking time. So remember, I told you that AGEs are a product. The formation is a product of time and temperature and ingredients. And so the disadvantages are that they can contain AGEs. And in fact, we have a study now comparing air dehydrated to a more gently cooked to kibble to can, and this was falling right in the middle of those. We get the nutrient loss. These can be energy dense. I have had one client that switched from a weight loss food to this food. Looked the same to him. They were both kind of dry, but he went from a food that was 300 calories per, about 350 calories per cup to 600 calories per cup, and couldn't figure out why the dog gained weight. So you just look at the label and there it is. And these have to be rehydrated, so it takes some planning. From a nutritional perspective, these can start out cooked, the ingredients, or they can start out raw. And I think many of them are marketed as raw, even though some of those ingredients, let's just say they put, I don't know, some barley in there. Barley needs to be cooked to make it usable. So it may be that some of them are cooked, but the meat is raw, and they call the whole thing raw. So you just have to be really careful about nomenclature there. All right. So let's go quickly to minimally processed foods, and I'll start with the fresh cooked. And so those, in the U.S. at least, are generally steamed or prepared by sous vide, which is kind of a weird boiling, but it's low temperature for a few hours is what it is. In both cases, you have to make sure that the internal temperature reaches this minimum of 71 degrees centigrade, so that takes some time. They do keep for a while frozen, but not thawed, and often in the U.S. they're sold as individual meals. Again, it takes planning, and they may contain AGEs depending on all these things I've told you about before, and since they involve heat, they can involve loss of essentials and extra nutritionals, but I think I think the cost is the most important factor to most pet owners. These can be pretty expensive. Really expensive, actually. The nutritional characteristics are not all that different from the air dehydrated ones, except for right now on the market, most of the ones that we have are complete and balanced, where the air dehydrated ones often are complementary in some way. Ultra-pasteurized food. So these are also a little new on our market. You've seen them. I don't know if you have in your dairy section milk that lasts for like 2 months. It's got a 2-month expiration date on it. So generally that's been prepared like this. You can see soups are prepared like this. And the product, Just Food for Dogs, has been on the market now for a while. We've got an expert in Tetra Pak with Mark Roberts over here. He works for a company that's beginning to private label these for other companies, so I think you're going to see a lot more of them out there now. It is cooked. It can have a it can be like canning, that you have to develop the cooking time and temperature for your product. These are pretty similar products in the box, though, so far. The thing about them is that unlike canning, they generally bring them up to a higher temperature, and they don't cook them for as long. That's the difference between Tetra Pak and canning. Same problems with cans, though. We get nutritional compound loss and AGEs. Right now, I don't know if most of them are complete and balanced or not. What I've seen, they are, but I don't know if they're going to stay that way. And the nutrient profile will vary. So, for instance, that product I showed you, Just Food for Dogs, is pretty high in starch, whereas we're producing one that we had to get reformulated that's not going to be so high in starch. So I think they're going to vary according to company. So again, look at labels. Freeze-dried foods. So freeze drying is basically you take the food, put it under a vacuum, and then you remove water loss that way, but the food is frozen at the time. And this is the fastest growing food type right now, at least in the U.S. It's very popular there. The ingredients can be either raw or cooked before drying, and so they can vary. So they may have a raw label on them or not. Freeze drying makes a product that is really shelf stable for a couple of years, so that's a big advantage. Again, these can be very energy dense since they're dried, so we have to be worried about that. Same problems as any cooked product, that they can be high in AGEs, they can lose nutritional compounds. If they are raw, this is one thing to be aware of. If they are raw, they may have pathogens in them. I think there is a big misconception about freeze drying being a pathogen mitigation step. It is not. That is how you preserve bacteria and viruses for the labs in some cases. So this is not a pathogen mitigation step. So if it's raw, when it goes into the freeze dryer, it's raw when it comes out in the less safe ways. Nutritional characteristics, these often are not complete and balanced. So you have to look at the label. But they're, as far as AGE content, it depends on the temperatures they use during their freeze drying process. I can tell you that I know of some that keep their temperatures under 100 degrees Fahrenheit, like less than body temperature. Honestly, I can't convert that to Celsius right now, I'm sorry. But there are some that go up to 120, so that's a little bit of heat, but it's still not like cooking. And then frozen raw foods, and I think you've heard enough about these by now. The raw materials vary. They can be what people call human grade, or they can be some of the same byproducts that are used for other foods of various quality. You probably are educated enough to know that byproduct is not a bad word. It depends on what the byproduct is. It can be organ meat. It can be poorly digestible leg parts that are full of animal fiber, because that's what animal fiber is, right? So they can vary in quality, and they are, because they're raw, they're going to be very low or free of AGEs, and there's going to be very minimal loss of nutritional compounds. Disadvantages: it requires planning ahead because you got to thaw them out. I had to get an extra freezer for my dog because it takes up a lot of space, and they're very expensive. So this keeps a lot of people using homemade instead of commercial raw products. But the difference is that the commercial raw products generally are careful in whatever way they're careful. They're careful about being aware of what pathogens are present in their factories and how they control those, and in their raw, and if they're raw materials. Nutritionally, at this point, I think there are more of them that are not complete and balanced. Aside here, I'm a veterinary nutritionist. I believe you should be feeding a complete and balanced diet. I can tell you that if you do this balance over time thing, it doesn't work. Those have been analyzed. People have, donated their weekly feeding plans. They've been analyzed. They are not complete and balanced over time. And in my opinion, you prevent the preventable. I mean, some of these nutritional deficiencies are really nasty, and I've seen them in practice. So you prevent the preventable. Use a complete and balanced diet. Generally, raw diets are very high in protein and fat and very low in carbohydrates, at least at this point in time. So, and probably will be, come to think of it. So you just have to be aware of that. If you have dogs or cats that are used to eating high carbohydrate commercial kibbles or even canned foods, and you switch them right over to a raw food, they're often going to get diarrhea, and that's just a temporary dysbiosis, and there are ways to deal with that you probably know about. So I get criticism from my veterinary nutritionist colleagues when they say, well, that's all fine, but why would I even recommend minimally processed diets? Why are they better? There's no data that says that I'm doing any harm by recommending kibble or canned foods instead. So I'm going to show you some studies where they went head to head, so to speak, as Matt said yesterday. This is an internal study where we looked at the antioxidant capacity of a few different kinds of food, and not surprisingly, raw food, either frozen or freeze-dried, had the highest antioxidant capacity. Whereas when you look at fresh cooked, and this was that Just Food for Dogs product, it decreases the antioxidant capacity by about half. Kibble really loses the day, doesn't it? So that decreases it down to about a third of what it was originally. A third of what the raw diets are. These are different diets. But this is really fascinating. This is a product that we used to sell. It was too expensive, had to take it off the market, but it was one of our kibbles combined with 20% freeze-dried raw pieces. And look what just 20% of raw food did to that kibble. It's really interesting. I just love this study. It was published last year by a Japanese or Korean group, I think it's Japanese group, where they looked at ragdoll kittens during growth, and they fed these kittens either a kibble, I think it was an IAMS, I believe, or a Royal Canin, sorry, and then they fed them a fresh diet. It was either cooked or it was raw. And I know that you cannot see that table at the top, but essentially they measured 3 markers of oxidative stress, and of the 3, 2 were lower in the raw and cooked minimally processed diets compared to kibble. But what's really fascinating is they did this scanning electron microscopy of hair shafts, and if you look on the right, both top and bottom, that's the raw food, and you can see how smooth those keratin scales are. Look in the middle, and that's the cooked food, almost as nice as the one on the right. And look on the left, That is from a kitten that ate kibble, and those keratin scales are all disrupted, and this is why I think that we see those beautiful raw coats. They're much nicer, more slippery, smoother hair shafts. This was an interesting study that was commissioned by Fresh Pet, which is a cooked frozen diet in the U.S. They took 8 dogs and fed them one diet or another, and then they crossed them over. So this is a crossover trial. It's a pretty good, high-quality study. And when they looked at, for instance, the fecal microbiome, they found that diversity was higher. And as Matthew said earlier, that doesn't necessarily mean good or bad, but it is very different, and that has health implications, as you learned today. But something that I just want to take note of, and that is that there was a decreased porphyromonas. This was skin microbiome. I'm sorry if I didn't say that. This is skin microbiome, not gut microbiome. Porphyromonas is a bacterium that, I don't understand how it works, but essentially it has a pigment, or it combines with saliva and tears. So the pigment, I think, is in the saliva and tears, and the bacterium converts it to being visible. I don't know how it works, but it's Porphyromonas that does this. And look at that, decreased Porphyromonas in the skin of these dogs. And I've heard this over and over clinically, where people have these white dogs with tear staining or white feet, and they lick their feet because of atopic dermatitis, and you put them on raw and that goes away. So this is some corroboration showing why that might happen. There are 3 studies that I know of looking at blood metabolomics, serum metabolomics, in dogs eating either dry or raw diets. And I don't have to tell you about Robin Moore's work because he talked about it already. The second study is by another group at University of Helsinki that I don't hear much about. I don't know them. Hopefully you know them. But they looked at blood work on 2,000 dogs eating either dry or raw food, and found that there were these differences in metabolic end products, like you do. But the one at the end is really interesting. This just came out last year, and it came out of the Dog Aging Project. And one of the things that they found in their metabolomics results were these post-translationally modified amino acids. So for anybody who doesn't know, amino acids are the building blocks of proteins. So individual amino acids can go through all kinds of changes before they're incorporated into a protein or after they're broken down from a protein. These post-translationally modified amino acids probably have some meaning. We just don't know what they are. But in particular, they found one, S-methylcysteine, was higher in dogs that were old and dogs that ate kibble. Well, isn't that interesting? Interesting study. I'm not going to go through these in detail, but I am going to tell you that there are now 4, count them, 4 studies showing that raw food has an anti-inflammatory effect. And our colleagues, veterinarians and nutritionists, are still saying there's no evidence of any benefit to feeding raw. This is one study where they actually looked at 5 different food formats and looked at a bunch of different analytes. This is a big, busy study from a big, busy lab. They found that the dysbiosis index, which is that test of the microbiome that you get from the Texas A&M, from the GI lab there, it was lowest in the dogs that ate kibble. But I think you have to remember that the test normals were developed from dogs eating kibble. So of course it was lower in the dogs eating kibble. I'm not sure what that means in this study, in other words. The raw-fed dogs had higher Peptidobacter hieronymus, and you heard a couple times today, that's a key indicator of gut health because it's one that converts primary to secondary bile acids, and it goes low when the gut microbiome is sick. So that was higher in raw-fed dogs. And then there were some of these changes in the blood work, in particular in the raw and cooked diet dogs. The alkaline phosphatase and the triglycerides were higher for the dry than the cooked and raw dogs. Sorry, so the way I put it before, in the cooked and raw fed dogs, the alkaline phosphatase and the triglycerides were lower. we don't have time to go into what that means, but I would like to point out that this is not the only study that said that. There are now five studies showing the same thing. Alkaline phosphatase and triglycerides go down in dogs that eat raw or other minimally processed foods. We also, these studies that have looked at clinical pathology, a lot of them are inconsistent. They're all over the place, but that's one of the most consistent findings, and I think we can take that as gospel at this point. We're not quite there, but we are seeing consistency in, for instance, albumin, serum albumin, that tends to go up in raw-fed dogs. I don't know if that's just because the protein contents typically are higher, and that's probably what it is, but I don't know that for sure. And then in cats, we don't have nearly as many studies, but there is these two studies showing that heating food results in higher globulin levels. And I don't know what that means either, but globulin is essentially your antibodies. It might say that they are fighting disease. So if that's associated with cooking, I don't really know why it would be, but it's interesting. Now, one of the criticisms that I get when I show data like that is, well, so what? These diets have completely different ingredients. They have completely different nutrient profiles. How can you compare them? And we do have a few studies where the diets are identical, kind of. The first one is really interesting. It is in minks, and they fed the same diet and cooked in raw form. There were definite differences. The minks that were fed the cooked diet had kidney lesions in greater numbers than the minks fed raw diets, and they grew more slowly. This one by Kai, the second one, I don't have time to go through it, and I'm not all that interested in doing so because they had a diet they called raw that was not raw. And of course, there are people out there presenting that as a valid study. The Wong study that I just showed you about the kittens, that's a pretty good one. And that also showed that cooked food resulted in a higher globulin level. One that came out of University of Georgia, Nikki Kamak's colleague, she is the one that looked at 4 different food formats. She looked at AGEs both in the food and then in the plasma of these dogs. And they were certainly higher in the, if you look at total AGEs, it was different for individual compounds, but total AGEs were definitely higher in the kibble and canned food diets, and those were higher than the dehydrated diet, and the dehydrated diet was higher than the sort of less cooked diet. And then finally, this older study from Illinois, I believe, showing that creatinine is contained in dog blood, cat blood in higher levels than in kibble, and that may be because, again, they're higher in protein. Also, in this one, in these cats, triglycerides were higher for the raw group and than the kibble group. And I don't know what's different about cats. Nobody knows what's different about cats in many cases. We just don't know enough about cats. And so I will start closing by just kind of summarizing these studies that are comparing the different pet food formats head to head. So first of all, I love the mink study. Ferrets, no, they're minks, and I put ferrets here, where they showed that cooked diets, the same diet in cooked form, led to more kidney lesions and slower growth. There are studies that show that these heat-processed foods lead to greater plasma and urine AGE levels beyond just the Briggs-Nelsing study from UGA. As I said, there were 4 studies showing a clear anti-inflammatory effect, and a study or 2 showing an antioxidant effect of raw compared to kibble. I told you that raw leads to a better hair coat quality and a more diverse skin microbiome with less porphyromonas, and that raw, for clinical pathology, raw feeding leads to a higher albumin level and lower triglycerides, alkaline phosphatase, creatinine in dogs, cholesterol, and globulins compared to kibble. And then there's this criticism, how can you compare these? And I'm going to just throw that back in the faces of the people that say that and tell them that we are challenging the standard here, just like they did in the 80s and 90s when the research started to come up saying maybe a diet that is full of vegetables and fruits and whole grains and fish and nuts was healthier than a diet that contained processed fast foods. That's a whole diet. It's the same thing. It's different ingredients, different nutrient profiles, and yeah, the food companies fought it for a while, but I think it's clear that there is a difference, and they're now making recommendations to go to less processed, healthier diets, and I think that we can get there with ours. I don't necessarily want you to leave here with the impression that I am coming down 100% on the side of raw and minimally processed foods. I like them. I feed them to my animals, but not everybody is the same, and there are advantages to other kinds of foods. So again, I put this as kind of the spectrum from top to bottom, and depending on what you consider to be an advantage or a disadvantage, you can look at it this way. So the processed, more traditional foods are more often complete and balanced, and that's something that if you've got a client who really can't handle much more information, when you try to tell them how to determine that a diet is complete and balanced, maybe that's the thing to do, is to send them toward the traditional companies making those pet food formats. The other ones, you just don't know unless you know how to read the label. AGE content, the more it's cooked, the higher it's going to be. Whole food ingredients, even if that's what is purported to be in a kibble or a canned food, labeling laws make that an iffy proposition. So I wouldn't count on it, but these other types of foods kind of, at least at this point, are largely whole food ingredients, if that's important to you. Nutrient loss from processing, the more they're cooked, the more is lost. And convenience, again, this is really important to some groups of people, and so you can see that the more traditional foods are going to be more convenient, and cost is the big one for us. Unfortunately, the highly processed diets are the ones that are more affordable. I'll just put this up here because I do every time I talk. People will end by, or I'll end my talk and people say, well, recommend a brand. There's so many out there, just say it. And I can't, because in your country, the ones that I like are going to be different from the ones in my country. And I do subscribe to the philosophy that companies have to be reliable. They have to have a track record of safety. This is published by the World Small Animal Veterinary Association, and it has these questions that you can ask companies. It has been criticized as favoring the big three, the international big three, but I would argue that it's because the international big three have gotten good at this. They've gotten really good at safety, right? So these questions about what to look for in a label are pretty standard, but they say, what do you look for in a brand? Does the brand have a nutritionist? I think that's a big advantage, and I've certainly seen some major scary mistakes from the smaller brands that don't have a nutritionist. Even those who say that they consult with a nutritionist, if they don't have a nutritionist on staff, I can tell you the consultants, Mark and I were joking about this before, you don't have the time or the motivation, and you're not paid to stay in touch with every company you've ever consulted for and tell them, well, this has changed. Well, maybe you should do this. So they need to have a nutritionist on staff. Who formulates the diets? Nutritionists don't formulate diets. These are people with bachelor's degrees and master's degrees, and when they're experienced, they're much better than we are at it. They need to have a lot of knowledge about food ingredients, about what processing does to those ingredients separately and together, and about packaging, about storage. They've got a lot of knowledge, so they need to be experienced. And then these other questions, what kind of product research? Obviously, I think that's a good idea. And who makes the food? And generally, you can tell if it's made by a co-packer if the address on the package is not the same as the company's main address. So I really like this, and you can get it off of their website. So that was a lot. Did I finish on time?